Okay, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm going to be giving you the transcendental argument for God's existence, which is identified in my presentation as the intelligibility argument. The intelligibility argument is going to prove the existence of the triune God because it has three premises followed by a conclusion. It's a valid argument, it's a sound argument, it's a cogent argument. And I'm going to be telling you why as we go through the premises and the defense of the premises. So it begins as follows. If intelligibility exists, then intelligibility requires a sufficient ultimate ground. P2. Intelligibility exists. P3. Only the triune God, Yahweh, satisfies the necessary conditions for the sufficient ultimate ground of intelligibility. Conclusion. Therefore, the triune God, Yahweh, exists. This is the transcendental argument because it asks what must be true in order for reasoning, logic, meaning, knowledge, identity, morality, and rational experience to be possible at all. So I'm going to be defending each of the premises as we go along. So premise one goes like this. If intelligibility exists, then intelligibility requires a sufficient ultimate ground. Now, before I continue, for those of you who are logic nerds like myself, I'm going to tell you what the inference rules are before we continue. So the inference rules that are used in the transcendental argument that I'm using right now are modus ponens, hypothetical syllogism, reductio ad absurdum, and from that, the reductio ad absurdum, we have the elimination of alternatives, and we also have what is called transcendental retorsion, which is not an inference rule, but a principle where if you deny the ultimate grounding for intelligibility without a rational basis, then you commit the fallacy of retorsion. Okay, so premise one, defense. If intelligibility exists, then intelligibility requires a sufficient ultimate ground. This premise is grounded in, here we go, the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. This premise is grounded in the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason says that things do not simply float without explanation. Reality, facts, logic, order, causality, moral obligation, rational inference, and intelligibility must have an adequate reason or ground. This is something that is a reality thing. To deny that things have reasons for their existence is to literally use the thing that you're denying. Because there is a reason for you saying that things exist for no reason. And hence, it is a self-referential inconsistency, the fallacy of retortion, and a performative contradiction. But let's continue. So intelligibility includes logic, identity, causality, induction, mathematics, language, predication, truth, morality, memory, rational inference, unity and diversity, universals and particulars, and correspondence between mind and world. These cannot be brute facts. To say logic just exists, reason just works, reality just happens to be intelligible. To say logic just exists, reason just works, reality just happens to be intelligible is not an explanation. It is an arbitrary stopping point. A brute fact destroys rational inquiry because it says, here explanation ends for no sufficient reason. But if explanation can arbitrarily stop anywhere, then there is no principled reason to stop at matter, chance, consciousness, laws of nature, or anything else. Therefore, intelligibility requires a sufficient ultimate ground. Now the defense, further defense of premise one. Premise one is based in reality because all rational activity assumes that things are not arbitrary. Science assumes causality, uniformity, order, and intelligible structure. Logic assumes identity, non-contradiction, valid inference, and stable meaning. Morality assumes real obligation, distinction between good and evil, and accountability. Logic assumes meaning. Rather, language assumes meaning, reference, identity, and shared rational structure. If intelligibility had no sufficient ground, then all of these would collapse into unexplained accident. Thus, premise 1 is not arbitrary. It is not an assertion. It is required by rational inquiry itself. Now, premise 2. Intelligibility exists. This premise is grounded in actual experience. We do not merely theorize about intelligibility. We use it constantly. Every time someone argues, questions, reasons, doubts, denies, affirms, investigates, speaks, understands, they presuppose intelligibility. They affirm intelligibility in their actions. Even the atheist who says, the positive atheist rather, who says, God does not exist, must rely on logic, meaning, identity, language, inference, rational order, and truth. If someone says intelligibility does not exist, they must use intelligibility to make the statement. That is self-defeating. That is self-referential inconsistency, a performative contradiction, and the fallacy of retortion. So premise 2 is undeniable in practice. You have to be crazy to deny it. Now the defense, a further defense of premise 2. Premise 2 is based in reality because intelligibility is directly experienced and performatively unavoidable. You cannot deny logic without using logic. You cannot deny meaning without using meaning. You cannot deny truth without making a truth claim. You cannot deny identity without identifying what you are denying. You cannot deny rationality without presenting reasons. So intelligibility is not optional. It is the precondition of all debate, all science, all thought, all communication, and all objection. Therefore, intelligibility exists. Now, premise 3. Only the triune God Yahweh satisfies the necessary conditions for the sufficient ultimate ground of intelligibility. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road, guys. This is where my argument stands or falls, because I have to prove that this is not just an assertion. I have to actually show you, I have to actually prove to you, I have to actually give you evidence that supports this claim, that supports this premise. And what I'm going to do to actually prove this to you is lay out the reasons. So the first one is reductio ad absurdum, elimination of alternatives based on that. The ROCS framework, so that's an acronym, ROCS, Rational Ontological Correspondence System, and comparative transcendental analysis. The ultimate ground of intelligibility must be necessary, self-existent, eternal, immutable, non-contingent, rational, personal, omniscient, sovereign, morally perfect, transcendent, immanent, able to ground unity and diversity, able to ground universals and particulars, able to ground logic and morality, able to ground mind-world correspondence. Only Yahweh satisfies this set. Now, this is why matter cannot ground intelligibility. Matter is contingent, changing, divisible, finite, non-rational in itself. But logic is immaterial, universal, invariant, necessary, normative. Changing physical particles cannot ground universal laws of logic. Matter may be governed according to rational structure, but it cannot be the ultimate source of rational structure. So materialism fails. Why chance cannot ground intelligibility? Chance is not a causal power. Chance does not actualize, sustain, govern, or explain. Chance presupposes probability, order, possibility, and a structured field of events. So, chance cannot be the ultimate ground of intelligibility because chance itself needs intelligible conditions in order to be meaningful. Chance fails. Brute facts cannot ground intelligibility. Brute facts say, this just is. But that destroys explanation. If intelligibility is brute, then logic, morality, causality, induction, and reason are arbitrary. But arbitrary foundations cannot ground rational necessity. Therefore, brute facts fail. Why human reason cannot ground intelligibility. Human reason is finite, dependent, fallible, changeable, historically located, and derivative. Human reason uses logic. It does not create the laws of logic. Human reason discovers intelligible order. It does not ground intelligible order. Thus, human reason cannot be ultimate. Why abstract concepts cannot ground intelligibility. Some may appeal to abstract objects, logic, numbers, universals, propositions, but abstract objects do not cause, sustain, govern, command, reveal, or account for why minds correspond to reality. To actually appeal to abstract objects is called the stipulation of abstraction, which is called the reification fallacy. Abstractions do not do anything. They're not natured entities. Abstract laws may describe necessary relations, but they do not explain why they are real and why reality is structured according to them or why rational minds can know them. Therefore, abstract objects are insufficient. Why polytheistic gods cannot ground intelligibility. The gods of the nations fail because they are usually born, changing, limited, morally flawed, subject to fate, dependent on creation, localized, in conflict, or bound to natural forces. A contingent God cannot ground necessary truth. A morally unstable God cannot ground objective morality. A finite God cannot ground universal intelligibility. A nature-bound God cannot ground nature itself. Therefore, polytheistic gods fail. Why non-Trinitarian monotheism fails. A bare monadic deity may claim unity, but it struggles to ground diversity, relation, love, communication, and personal plurality as eternal realities. If ultimate reality is pure solitary unity, then plurality becomes secondary, derivative, or less ultimate. But reality contains both unity and diversity. The one and the many problem requires an ultimate where unity and diversity are equally ultimate. The Trinity uniquely supplies this. You have to excuse me, I bit my tongue, so my pronunciation is pretty bad on certain words. Okay, so the Trinity uniquely supplies this. One essence, three persons. Unity and diversity are equally ultimate in God himself. Therefore, the triune God uniquely grounds the structure of reality. Why Yahweh alone satisfies the conditions. Yahweh is self-existent, eternal, immutable, omniscient, omnipotent, morally perfect, personal, sovereign, the creator, sustainer, and governor of all things. The triune God grounds logic through his rational nature, morality through his holy nature, causality through his sovereign power, unity and diversity through his triunity, personhood through eternal personal relationships, knowledge through his divine omniscience, induction through his providential governance, meaning through the eternal Logos, identity through divine self-consistency, possibility and impossibility through his decree and nature. Thus, Yahweh alone provides the rational ontological correspondence system. Now, what does this mean? This means reality is rationally structured because it is grounded in the rational triune God, and human minds can know reality because they are created in his image. And what it also means is that the foundation corresponds with what flows from it. Reality corresponds to its ultimate. Now, defense of premise 3. Premise 3 is really based on reality because all alternative explanations fail under examination. The argument does not merely assert only Yahweh can ground intelligibility. It demonstrates it by eliminating rival candidates. Matter collapses into contingency. Chance collapses into non-explanation. Brute facts collapses into arbitrary stopping points. Human reason collapses into finitude. Abstract objects collapse into causal impotence. Polytheism collapses into contingency and fragmentation. Non-Trinitarian monism collapses into inability to ground unity and diversity equally. But Yahweh satisfies the necessary conditions without contradiction. Therefore, premise 3 is not speculation. It is the conclusion of reductio and elimination. And another note, there is something that I have done that most people haven't done, and I will not say that no one has ever done it. No one that I know of has ever done it. And I have personally done the transcendental comparative analysis of all of the major gods of all of the major continents. And I'm talking about the umbrella nomenclature that is used to encompass and encapsulate all of the continents, all of the countries. I've done transcendental analysis for all of the major gods of Africa, the ancient Near East, Asia, Europe, Americas, and Oceania. All 6, I have done the transcendental analysis for all of the gods that are major gods in these regions. And I've come up with a little over 300 gods. So the billions and millions of gods in existence is actually a myth if you use a specific criteria that you will get from actually studying the literature and reading about the gods. So it is not the case that there are millions and millions of gods who matter. People can come up with gods in their minds all the time, and to actually examine all of those gods would be impossible in one's lifetime. But to actually study the ultimates that are claimed to be ultimates by regions in the world, you only get a few. You only get a few. I've done the work. So when I say Yahweh is the only one whose attribute set is reflected in reality perfectly, that's a fact. Now, to quickly close this off. Conclusion. Therefore, the triune God Yahweh exists. The conclusion follows necessarily. If intelligibility requires sufficient ultimate ground, intelligibility exists, and only Yahweh satisfies that ground, then necessarily the triune God Yahweh exists. This conclusion is not merely probable. It is transcendentally necessary. Why? Because denying Yahweh requires using the very intelligibility that Yahweh alone grounds. This is the fallacy of retortion. The positive atheist cannot argue against God without borrowing logic, identity, inference, meaning, coherence, causality, and rationality. But those realities require the very God being denied by the positive atheist. Therefore, the denial of God is self-defeating. And sometimes this stupid question comes out. Why? Could it be something else? Asking, could it be something else, is not a refutation. The atheist, whether they are passive or active, whether they are positive or negative, they will say, maybe it could be something else. But that's not an argument. A question is not a negation. A possibility is not an actuality. A hypothetical is not a defeater. To refute the argument, the atheist must show premise 1 is false, premise 2 is false, premise 3 is false, or the argument is invalid. Mere possibility do none of these. So unless the atheist, whether they are positive atheists or negative atheists, provides an actual negator, the argument stands. And this is not burden shifting, because if you guys did not know, burden shifting is a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. This is when you make a claim without defending the claim, without giving reasons for the claim, and then you ask someone to refute, negate, or prove you wrong. It's like me saying leprechauns exist. Prove me wrong. I gave no reasons. I gave no justification. I gave no premises. I gave no form of rational reason for you to believe it. And then after making the claim, I said, defend the opposite or prove me wrong. That's not what I just did. I gave my claims and I gave I gave my claim and I gave my reasons for my claim. If you can't negate my claim, then my argument stands. If you cannot negate my claim, if you cannot refute the arguments of my claim, then my conclusion stands. Yahweh exists. Now, just to restate the argument quickly before I close. If intelligibility exists, then it requires a sufficient ultimate ground. Intelligibility exists. Only the triune God satisfies the sufficient ultimate grounding of intelligibility, the triune God Yahweh. Therefore, the triune God Yahweh exists. The intelligibility argument is valid because the conclusion follows from the premises. It is sound because the premises are grounded in reality. Premise 1 is grounded in the PSR, principle of sufficient reason. Premise 2 is grounded in universal experience. Premise 3 is grounded in reductio ad absurdum, which produces elimination. And the rocks principle, something that is actually a real thing in reality, we actually observe and see where things correspond to their ultimate foundation. Therefore, the conclusion follows. So, the triune God Yahweh exists as the ultimate, unifying, causal natured entity who actualizes, sustains, governs, and grounds all reality. Intelligibility, logic, morality, possibility, and meaning. That is the claim that was defended in this video. I hope that you learned something. I know the video is fast, but you can always pause the video and look at the words that are up here. They're up here. Somewhere in this area, you should see some words. So pause the video, look at the words, examine the argument, give me your comments, give me your responses, and just mark, I am not going to be interacting with any response that does not attempt to negate or refute my premises, because you guys saying you're unconvinced, you guys asking me questions that have already been answered in the arguments, I'm just going to ignore them because they're irrelevant. I don't care if you're unconvinced. I don't care about your questions of, but it could be this, but it could be that. That's a fallacy. And I don't care about your criteria of belief that you violate yourself. I don't care. I don't care. So looking forward to the comments that actually engage the argument and attempt to refute the argument. And I will try to respond in a timely manner. All right. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for coming. This has been a blast.